On this episode of Forge and Anvil, we will discuss the 2024 election and whether or not we have any hope of winning the White House. We'll spend some time focusing on one of the key swing states, Arizona, as well as evaluate the potential three-way slugfest that will be the 2024 Arizona Senate race. Finally, we'll ask the question many great minds have been debating, which is, should conservative voters leave their blue states and move to red and purple states? All of this and more, so stick around. Welcome to Forge and Anvil. My name is Connor. I am host of this podcast. I am joined tonight by two first-time guests. The first one is State Representative Austin Smith. So, Austin, say hello. Tell the audience who you are and what you do.
Thanks, Connor. I'm happy to be here. Thanks, Will, for doing as well. Good to see you, Gavin. My name is Austin Smith. I'm a state representative here in Arizona. I'm also the enterprise director at Turning Point Action, the 501c4 sister organization, Turning Point USA. I oversee our national field program across the country, and our target states like Nevada, Arizona. We're based here in Arizona, Wisconsin, Iowa, Ohio, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, Georgia, and Florida. Arizona, Georgia, and Wisconsin, those are the three states to taking back the White House, potentially taking back the United States Senate. Line in the sand right now. I feel like 2024, those three states, the map only is going to go a certain way, regarding like Pennsylvania and Ohio and Florida. We have to win Arizona, Georgia, and Wisconsin. If we don't win all three of those states, we're not going to get back to the White House for a very long time. And that's truly unfortunate, but that's the reality that we're living in. So I'm happy to talk about that a little bit more today and what conservatives, America First people, are doing to take back the White House and play a little bit of offense here. So happy to be here.
Well, welcome in. We'll definitely unpack a lot of what you said there because that's definitely what I want us to focus in on tonight. And we're also joined by first-time guest Gavin Wax. So Gavin, same thing. Introduce yourself.
Well, it's great to be here, including with my good friend Austin Smith, who I know from the YRs. I run the New York Young Republican Club. We're the oldest and largest young Republican club in the country, fighting in the belly of the beast that is New York City. My day job, I'm the executive director of the National Constitutional Law Union, representing a lot of Americans whose constitutional rights have been violated. Think of it as like a conservative alternative to the ACLU. I have a book coming out with my co-author, Troy Olson, hopefully by the end of this year, entitled The Emerging Populist Majority, building off books from the past that you may have heard of, including the Emerging Democrat Majority, which has been proven, obviously, not to be a factually accurate book. And then the previous book, The Emerging Republican Majority from the 1960s, talking about the Nixon landslide and all the rest. So in addition to that, I do a lot of online writing, whether it's for Daily Caller, Town Hall, Newsmax, etc. And I'm really looking forward to the discussion, guys.
Awesome. Well, welcome in. And as you can see, Michael is on vacation. So I asked Will from Renaissance of Men to help me co-host. He's going to be actually watching the chat on Rumble. So if any of you are on Rumble, feel free to send in questions, just general comments, and we will read some of those on air. And of course, we'll do the same for YouTube. But Will, please introduce yourself for those who are not yet familiar.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Connor. It's good to be with you, Austin and Gavin. I'm the host of the Renaissance of Men podcast, documenting the 40-year redemption of masculinity that's going on all around us, and promoting that along with men's mentorship and a men's group. And so I'm very excited to be talking with you guys because I think the things that I study and the things that I'm interested in feed very much into what you guys are working towards for 2024, just a rediscovery of masculine values that needs to happen within America and the West.
Awesome. Well, glad to have you back, Will. We'll go ahead and dive into our first story. But before we do that, if you have not already followed us on Twitter, feel free to do so at Forge and A. This is from the Post Millennial. Trump beats Biden in general election and dominates GOP primary. Top DeSantis by 40 points, Harvard-Harris poll. So, if it'll load for me here, former President Donald Trump is beating President Joe Biden in a new national election poll and is dominating the Republican Party primary with a 40-point lead over Florida Governor Ron DeSantis. According to new Harvard-Harris poll, Trump is the clear favorite of the GOP nomination, leading with 52% over DeSantis' 12%. In addition, Trump has a 42-point lead over third-place candidate Vivek Ramaswamy. The national poll was conducted with 2,068 registered voters, and results were weighted by political party affiliation, region, and other demographics. In a matchup for the presidency, Trump pulls ahead and wins a hypothetical horse race against Biden by 5 points and leads against Vice President Kamala Harris by 9 in another potential matchup. Voters who were polled for the general election were asked if the 2024 election for president were held today and it was between Donald Trump, the Republican, and Joe Biden, the Democrat, who would you vote for? The same question was asked for Harris in place of Biden. Although there is support for both Trump and Biden in a head to head matchup for the presidency, 2/3 of voters do not wish to see Biden run, while less than 6 in 10 say the same for Trump. 57% of those polled also said they would consider an independent moderate candidate, and 7% say they want another choice. Aside from the presidential race and GOP primary, the economy and recent Supreme Court cases were also highlighted in the poll. A majority of voters believed that Trump and Republicans in Congress understand the economy better than Biden. Independents split 60% to Trump and 40% to Biden on the subject of the economy. The majority of voters also thought that Trump had better economic policies than Biden does now. As far as Supreme Court cases, a majority of voters think that some of the recent major cases decided by the Supreme Court ended with a correct winning ruling. 56% of voters in the poll agreed that abortion laws should be left to the states instead of being a constitutional right. And 60% agreed that people who design websites do not have to design a site for a gay wedding if that's against their religious belief. The case overruling affirmative action was also supported by over 2/3 of those polled. Other topics such as student loans, January 6th, and the war in Ukraine were also covered. So we'll go ahead and leave that there. There's obviously a lot in this article to unpack, a lot of things that are interesting points that the poll covers here. Personally, I don't care much for polls, mostly because we've seen a lot of historical inaccuracies with polling. I will say that the midterm election for 2022, the polling seemed to be a little bit more accurate. What that means, though, is kind of up to your interpretation, given I think most people don't trust pollsters these days. That's pretty evident. But either way, there's still a lot of great conversational topics that we can use for this article here. One of the interesting things that I saw was, of course, the fact that Trump is already stated to be able to beat Biden in the general, which is something that so many people keep saying is impossible. So obviously we're having a primary going on right now. I have been pretty agnostic on the primary. If you've been following me for much, I comment here and there, but I have not necessarily been a full-throated endorser of any one candidate, because ultimately I think the mechanics is going to be the number one thing that we need to focus on right now. It is clear that there is a machine built to oppose any Republican candidate, and that's a lot of what we're going to focus on tonight. But first, I'll turn it over to you, Austin, to get your initial reaction to this post-millennial article and the poll.
So it's really interesting. I don't know if you saw it or not, but a few weeks ago there was a poll that was also done in Florida that had Trump up 50 points over DeSantis with young Republican voters. And so millennials, Gen Z, they overtook the boomers in this last election cycle. And you'll see a lot from, the TikTok Gen Z influencers and even some of the crazy purple-haired people on Twitter that Gen Z is going to crush the GOP. It was like, well, actually, the GOP is making really good inroads with younger voters, and specifically people like Donald Trump, who has more of a heartbeat and a pulse on the conservative movement and pop culture than any other president in our lifetime. He's a funny guy. So I'm not surprised at all that he's actually, performing better than Biden in these polls, way outpacing DeSantis, who, I got to interact with him last election cycle when Turning Point Action did some tours with him and stuff, but he's not that glue of a candidate that everybody knows about Donald Trump. And so I'm not too surprised with those type of polls there. Now, however, we're talking about the mechanics of things. The states like Arizona, where we're going to need, I know, Arizona is interesting because we've got as many or more independent voters, whether they're right-leaning or left-leaning, than we do have Republicans. And a lot of those people are just dissatisfied with the party. So our job is, as conservative activists, whether Trump's the nominee or DeSantis is the nominee, if the mechanics aren't in place, which we'll talk about a little bit later, winning states like Arizona and Georgia, it's going to still be tough because the left has a massive machine when it comes to ballot harvesting, ballot chasing. We experienced it really in 2018 when Arizona switched over to like the vote center model rather than the precinct model. During COVID, the mass mailing of ballots. And so we've seen polls like this before. So take it really with a grain of salt because the left has, ungodly amounts of money to swing elections. And that's definitely going to impact the Senate race here in Arizona with, Sinema running, Gallego running, and the only Republican who's announced so far is Sheriff Mark Lamb in Pinal County. Carrie Lake, has flirted with the idea of announcing. And so it's really just a three-way race right now between Mark Lamb, Sinema, and Ruben Gallego. With Trump on the ticket, Republican turnout is going to go up. And I think that's what killed us also in 2022 is that, we didn't perform in places that we should have. I'll give you a perfect example. Mojave County in Arizona in 2020 dominated for Donald Trump. It's the most Republican county in the state of Arizona. I went to their Mojave County GOP meeting a couple weeks ago, and I spoke to their chairwoman, and I asked her how many Republican votes were left on the table in Mojave County in 2022. And she said 8,000. Well, 8,000, that's the whole attorney general's race in Arizona by just under 200 votes. So these polls are good, but the mechanics part of it, we still have a lot of work to do between, 501c4s, PACs, young Republicans in the state, the RNC apparatus, the GOP apparatus as a whole. So it's good numbers, but we still have a long way to go.
Yeah, absolutely. And we're definitely going to talk through that Senate race in more detail. And I've made a couple mental notes of some of the things that you said here. I did want to go ahead and say hello to Shara Joel in the chat. She said, I don't listen to polls. You can't get an accurate measure for the country by asking less than 300, assuming they were all telling the truth. That one was 2,068, I think it said, but still, I totally understand what you're saying. You also might have meant to say 3,000 there, Shara. Not sure on that. And then Nika3 said, good afternoon. I follow Gavin on Twitter. I plan to vote Trump is part of the problem, poor funding by the GOP for certain candidates. We'll definitely get into the funding as well. But, hi, Susie Q. Welcome in the chat. But Gavin, we'll go ahead and turn it over to you for your initial reaction to the article before we go on to some of those questions.
Yeah, listen, I agree with pretty much everything that Austin just said. I'll touch on a few other points. I mean, first, with this specific poll, it's not an outlier. I mean, Trump has, been neck and neck in the RCP average. There have been series of polls that have shown him up by 3, 4, 5, 6. I mean, these are very substantial margins, especially when you factor in that these are, national popular vote polls, which he doesn't necessarily have to win. He could theoretically be in a D+2, D+3 environment and still win based on the electoral college and where those votes are spread out. And I would also make a historical point here that Trump never polled this well either in 16 or 20. I mean, this is looking to be, his most robust coalition, his strongest coalition going into election to date. And a lot of the circumstances in 2020 obviously are not going to be at play, or at least we hope, but I think it's safe to say they won't be at play this time around. We won't have a summer of love, quote unquote. We won't have, basically a color revolution. We won't have, all pandemic nonsense. So the lay of the land is going to be certainly different. So I'll put that out there. And then onto the general talk about polls. Yes, polls are flawed. It's really the only quantitative data we have to do some sort of election analysis at this stage. So it's not perfect, but it's what we have. We can look at historical analysis. We can look at other, measures. People don't like to talk about crowd size or whatever, or fundraising numbers. But really, everything we have available to us all have their flaws. But this is the best we have. I will make the argument that most of these polls are inherently biased towards Republicans, particularly towards someone like Trump. They are either, intentionally biased because they're pushing an agenda, or their methodology simply hasn't caught up with the times. I think the Trump movement, the populist movement, that sort of energy, a lot of these first-time voters, these nonpartisan voters that Trump was able to bring out to the fold, it's very hard to poll them. It's very hard to measure them because they're not your traditional voters. So all of those biases still exist in most of these polls. And the fact that Trump is overcoming those biases is actually something that I think is the biggest takeaway, because there's a built-in margin against him and most Republicans in general. When you're overcoming that, I think it does show a serious groundswell of support for that candidate, in this case, Donald J. Trump. So the polling for me has been a point of, optimism for his candidacy in the general election. And I think it runs contrary to what you alluded to earlier, being this sort of, this notion that he's unelectable that's being pushed by both the establishment and the left, when in reality, I mean, if we go by the only quantitative data we have, he is the most electable candidate going into 2024, and he's far more electable than he was in 16 or 20. So that's just that poll. That's just the polling. I'm confident going forward. But yes, as Austin said, there's a lot of logistical matters, mechanical matters, structural matters that we can't rest on our laurels on. And, obviously having a bigger margin helps, alleviate those concerns. But I do think this is still going to come down to the wire. I do think this is going to be a very close election. When you have these close elections, when you're talking about a few points on the margin, margin. We're talking about an attorney general race in Arizona with 200 votes. I mean, everything counts. All the auxiliary organizations and infrastructure that Austin mentioned, all of the legal, the legislative, matters as they relate to how these elections are conducted. That's how they matter. What are we doing to take advantage of, certain laws, whether we like them or not, where they exist, whether it is, ballot harvesting, whether it is early voting or mail-in voting. It's something that we need to actively discuss. And we've seen a precedent in the past where certain Republican parties in certain states and in certain localities, they have taken advantage of some of these electoral methods, whether it is early voting or mail-in voting or proxy voting, and they've seen some success with it. I'm not going to say that it's going to necessarily always work in our favor, but if given the tool, if it's legally allowed, and it's a viable electoral strategy, we should certainly use it. And once we're in power, then we could talk about reform. But, this is all very multifaceted. I think this is going to be a very unique election. We have two incumbents running against each other. We haven't seen this since Grover Cleveland in the 1800s. So it's really going to be record versus record. You're not going to have necessarily the incumbency advantage that you've seen in past elections. And I think it's really going to be one for the books. And it's going to be very hard to be super predictive about this because it's so novel in its very nature. But I'm sure we'll delve into those details as the show goes on.
Yes, we definitely will. And you bring up a lot of great points. And again, I've taken some notes and we'll break down some of what you've already laid out for us. Will, I want to give you a hard task, though. First of all, I want to get your initial reaction. But then beyond that, I'm going to give you a hard task by asking you to, because this could be a whole podcast on itself. So I'm going to ask you to give a super quick breakdown of why we should even care about this election from a Christian standpoint, because our podcast kind of operates in a funny area on the internet where we have a lot of churchgoers, deacons, pastors that listen into our podcast. And to some degree, we're some of these people's only source of news, because a lot of people are much more focused on their theology and their walk with Christ, which obviously is incredibly important. And you should probably know that if you watch the show frequently. But we're getting a lot more mechanical with this episode, and I think it's important for that exact group of people that I described a moment ago. But first and foremost, I'm going to turn it over to you to kind of quickly maybe sit those people down and tell them why this is an important podcast to listen to, even if it might be out of the ordinary for maybe some of the regular content that they listen to.
Sure. So I think the first thing to point out is that for me, my hope is not in politics. And I think that there are a lot of people listening that would agree. And I'm glad to see you nodding as well, because my hope is in the Lord Jesus Christ and not in politics. But that doesn't mean we throw politics out. And one of the things that I heard you guys say and it's hiding, not intentionally necessarily behind the phrase mechanical, is that there's a groundswell of support. And I think we saw this in 2016 and we saw it in 2020 for a Republican candidate. And it's not necessarily clear whether all the voters in the country voting for Donald Trump will result in a Donald Trump election. That there are significant strategic, legal shenanigans. Maybe you wouldn't use those words, but impediments to a vote equaling a vote. And I think that that's a really profound moral problem, and that should be of concern to many people. That alone means that this election is important, because the only hope of addressing the systemic moral problem from a position of like my vote as a man equals my vote as a man is to bring in someone who actually isn't necessarily taking advantage of those shenanigans. And so I think I could make the case that even setting aside things like Supreme Court cases, even setting aside, woke insanity, even setting aside anything like that, to say, if we want to live in a world where your yes means yes and your no means no, we have to bring in candidates that are committed to that perspective. And I don't see a commitment to yes means yes and no means no coming from the left at all. That's not what they do. But a belief in truth and a belief in individuals speaking up and their voice having an actual value is the real reason, I think, why many Christians should care to begin living in a country where that expression of our individual will is honored instead of discarded in favor of a statist agenda. And so again, the hope for salvation isn't in politics, but if we want to live in a nation that actually aligns with our Christian faith and values, the only hope for that is on the right. And that's That's what I would say there.
Yeah. Well said. Well said. I gave you a hard task, and I think you did a good job. So, yeah. Well, let's talk about. Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
Put me in. I was just you. Go ahead. Sorry. Put me in, Coach.
All right. Well, I'm going to go ahead and pull up 270 to win, because this is a great sort of introduction. Austin, you already brought up some of the key states that right now we need to really be focused in on for the 2024 election. I'd like to obviously get into future elections as well, because we do have to look past 2024. That is a big problem with our movement, is we often look just to the very next election. That's a big weakness. But regardless, there is an upcoming election, and we need to talk about that. So you guys let me know, Austin, Gavin, Will, if I have any of this off here. But 270 to win. This is so far the 2024 consensus. So I would say, if I add a tilt, you could probably say that right now Nevada tilts blue.
Correct.
And Pennsylvania probably tilts blue. Would that be fair?
Yeah.
Yeah. And
if we're not doing any toss-ups, right? Just this, we're trying to fill the map out.
Right. So right now, filling the map out, that's what we're looking at here. And I would say that these two are in a separate category from what I would consider to be a real 50-50 could go any way toss-up of Wisconsin, Arizona, and Georgia. Would that be fair?
Yeah, I mean, looking at this map, I mean, I would honestly put Michigan as tilt if we're going to get rid of all the toss-ups, to be honest. I think there have been some polls in Michigan that have been solid. And I guess, some of the polling, you could put these categories in tilt, but, it's really going to be subjective at the end of the day. And we're going to pick certain polls we want. I mean, I think Ohio is safe red. I think Iowa is safe red. I think they fully realigned. I agree with North Carolina. I think there's an argument to be made that Florida is going to be safe red too, but, we'll have to see. But this is on the margins. This is picking on the margins.
Right. And so if we were to fill in these toss-ups that we have listed here. So first and foremost, if we were to fill them in as tilt Republican,
right,
you could see here, we've got 272. It takes 270 electoral votes to win the White House. So we quite literally need every single one of those states, because if just one of those was to go blue, right, we have Joe Biden for another 4 years, or Kamala Harris, or whoever the nominee ends up being on the Democratic ticket. So that being said, there's a lot of things that we could talk about with each of these states, but we do have Austin here. So I want to focus a lot on Arizona and what can be done in Arizona to make sure that we have an effective turnout in 2024. And Austin, if you can maybe just speak to, kind of what the on the ground looks like for Arizona and where we currently sit.
Right. So let's go back and break this down to like 2016. Trump's running there. Obviously the Republican nominee. Hillary Clinton is the Democrat nominee. John McCain is running for his last term there. Arizona is still a Republican state. Jeff Flake was in the Senate at the time. Doug Ducey was still in his first term as governor. Republicans had about a 33 or 34, 35 seat majority in the House, 17 out of 30 in the state Senate. Adrian Fontes runs for county recorder for Maricopa County. If you're unfamiliar with Maricopa County, it's the fourth largest county in the country. I believe it still is the largest Republican county, voting county in the country, one of the most important battleground state or counties. As Maricopa goes, Arizona goes. The way Arizona goes, the country will go. Really because we've had an influx of millions of people moving to Arizona over the last, several years. So Adrian Fontes, who now is the Secretary of State, he then had run for county recorder. We really were focused on a precinct voting model where you vote in your precinct on election day, and that's how it always was in Arizona. He beats Helen Purcell, who had been the recorder for Maricopa County, I believe, since the 1980s, very long time. Went way past her time that she needed to be there for the county recorder's office, gave too much ground to the left, to the Mark Eliases of the world, the Democrats that came here to Arizona, just population change that happened in the state. So Adrian Fontes becomes the county recorder in 2016. He runs his first election for Maricopa County in 2018. Martha McSally was running for the United States Senate at the time against Kyrsten Sinema, who had been a state legislator in Arizona in a swing area of the state of Maricopa County, then became a congresswoman who really did have somewhat of a moderate tone, somewhat of a moderate record, but not on the, key Democrat platform issues, abortion, the Second Amendment, healthcare, taxes, working rights, so on and so forth. She runs for the United States Senate, gets the Democrat nominee. Doug Ducey wins, hand over foot for his reelection because he had a lot of name ID plus a record that he was running on. Sinema had a lead, going in through election day. They had a lot of mail-in ballots already out. We had the vote center model where polling locations did go down, but it wasn't that big of an issue like it was in 2020, 2022. 2020 rolls around. Adrian Fontes is still the Secretary of State. And, Arizona wasn't the only state where the secretaries of state went around their state legislatures and had a mass mail-in ballot system where that wasn't the law, where that just happened. So Maricopa County, obviously being the battleground that it is, 2022 rolls around. Actually, I should say it took almost 30 days for them to call the election in Arizona because of the mail-in ballots, because of, people dropping them off on election day in Maricopa County. That was the debacle. That was 2020. We still had the state legislature at the time after 2020 and the governor's office. We had, obviously, all of Arizona was at the forefront of the election integrity fight in 2020, or after 2020, excuse me. And Doug Ducey was the governor. Rusty Bowers, who some of you may know of, was the Speaker of the House, and Karen Fann was the President of the Senate. Give her when credit's due. Karen Fann was more of a establishment moderate legislator, and when she was Senate President, but she helped initiate the Maricopa County audit and brought a lot of the election integrity bills forward. Rusty Bowers either blocked or really killed, and some other establishment Republican legislators in Arizona for the election integrity fixes when Doug Ducey was governor. Back to square one in 2022. Obviously, everybody was nervous about the mail-in ballot system. There was no way to legally get around it. The right doesn't have a Mark Elias's of the world for here in Arizona. Arizona is drastically underfunded. Blake Masters was left to fend for himself. Essentially, Mitch McConnell's didn't help. The RGA was nowhere to be found for Kerry Lake. They didn't spend as much money as they needed to. Mark Fincham, who's running for Secretary of State, obviously didn't get enough. And so they're all the Democrat nominees that we have run against here in Arizona are not that popular in a state that structurally is conservative. But when you have, moderate Republicans or election laws in place where the left has been able to manipulate our elections, perfect example, Maricopa County, it's not Stephen Richer, who's our county recorder now, who beat Fontes in 2020, that actually runs our elections. He facilitates them as in counts the votes when they bring to the recorder's office. It's the board of supervisors that oversee our elections. And so in 2022, a lot of Republicans were excited to vote on election day because of the sour taste that was left in their mouth in 2020, of how well the left can manipulate, or I should say prostitute, the mail-in ballot system. And so that wasn't changed here in Arizona. And so what happens is that, 60% of the voting locations went down on election day. And why is that a problem? Well, when you have voting locations, you have hundreds, if not thousands of people going to one central area to get an on-demand printing ballot. That there's issues. They have the wrong size paper to print ballots on election day. So people who have to work a 9-to-5 job or 8 to 4, 8 to 6 can't stand in line all day. And the response from the county recorder's office and the board of supervisors was, well, those people had other places to vote. That's, pretty much unacceptable. And so a lot of people, we don't actually have a sufficient number of people who were actually disenfranchised on election day in Maricopa County. And so, regardless of what, Kerry's lawsuit, Abe's lawsuit, the fact of the matter is that people were disenfranchised on election day in 2022 in Maricopa County. I'm in the legislature now. We have 31 Republicans in the House. We have 16 Republicans in the Senate. That's a one-seat majority. We have a Democrat governor, a Democrat attorney general, and a Democrat secretary of state. I'm on the elections committee in the House. We have passed out all good election bills that shore up elections, that are strengthen our voter ID laws, that strengthen signature verification, that strengthen poll observing, that strengthen tabulation, so on and so forth. We had an omnibus of election bills this year. Hobbs didn't sign one of them. Some of them we didn't even get up on the board. And so election integrity is defense. We haven't played offense in the last 3 election cycles in Arizona. We just haven't. Mm-hmm. We've had conservatives in really good spots. Hat tip to my boss and our Arizona National Committeeman, Tyler Boyer, really rings the alarm bell against, what elections, what's happening, how they're manipulating it in those states. Giving credit is due, whether you liked her or not. Kelly Ward was an effective chairwoman because we were still able to win races in places that we need to. We don't have the entire machinery here in Arizona and Maricopa County. That's why it's so important to win Arizona, because the RNC has neglected Arizona in the past. The RGA really doesn't, because they don't have an election here. The NRSC with the Mitch McConnells don't do it. The NRCC really hasn't done it. If you look, David Schweikert, who represents the most swing area in Maricopa County for Congress, he raised just under or a little bit over $500,000 this year. He left. If you don't know this, he left the Freedom Caucus. He bashed the Freedom Caucus, whether because he said that was he didn't want to be associated with populism, when really his district is swing, and he can't be associated with that. And so he kind of threw conservatives under the mat there as the reason why he's getting out, and he didn't even raise enough money. So we're not in a good spot in Arizona right now because we don't have the financial infrastructure coming into place. We're really trying to build it here at Turning Point Action with our still vote on election day, mail-in ballot, early vote thing. We have to do all of them because none of the election changes were made between 2018 and 2022 that were significant for Arizona, plus the financial infrastructure. So that's why Arizona is so important, because if we don't have a Mark Elias that lives here in Arizona, we don't have 3 or 4 of them here in Arizona ready to sue the crap out of the Board of Supervisors or the Democrat Party. We just don't have that here. And so the left has poured in millions of dollars through C4s, through PACs, through 501c3s that offset their voter registration. They don't rely on the parties anymore. And this is what the Democrats have figured out in Arizona, because they mimicked it from Colorado to Arizona. And so we're fighting it tooth and nail in Arizona because we're just on the margins here. And Gavin brought it up. These elections will be won on the margins. And so that's why Arizona is so important. Carrie Lake, I think it was like 14,000 votes between her and Hobbs, 200 votes for Abe Hamadeh and Chris Mays. That's how thin these margins are going to be. And that's going to continue to be in that place until we can take Arizona back.
Yeah. Yeah. In the chat, Shara said, establishment Republicans are just as bad, in my opinion. And Nika 3 said, yes, Shara, lots of uniparty members in both sides of the aisle. Carmen says, I live in Maricopa County, moved here in 1980. I am voting for DeSantis, which that's fair. Right now, we're mostly just focusing on the general. We can talk through the primary a little bit at some point. I'm sure we're all itching to talk more on that as well, since it is the topic of the day. But I wanted to talk through there, Austin. You brought up Carrie Lake and you brought up the Attorney's General race. So with Abe Hamadeh only losing by, I think it was 208. It was right around 200 votes. So I know there's been a lot of litigation on that front. Can you give us a super quick update on where that stands?
Yeah. So really grateful for Abe Hamadeh, good buddy of mine. He would have been the first young Republican ever elected Attorney General. He's a really good guy, really good conservative. Fighting tooth and nail through his court cases. He had to get it set up in Mojave County because no judge in Maricopa County obviously would hear the case. So he made it to Mojave County to ask for a new trial. The judge unfortunately said no trial. So he's appealing it to the Supreme Court for the Supreme Court of the state of Arizona. So we'll see. He's fighting tooth and nail, and there's ballots that still haven't been counted. And I'll name names. Rachel Mitchell, who's the county attorney for Maricopa, she hasn't been very helpful in the fact of getting those ballots that are left in Maricopa County. We have to have a conservative county, Mojave, through the Yavapai or Cochise, that will take Abe's case, but obviously he's going to appeal it to the Supreme Court. Whatever he needs, I'm backing him all the way. The legislature obviously signed on earlier in the year for an amicus brief supporting his case. It's the closest race in the history of Arizona, and there's ballots that still haven't been counted. And we have to find a levy through the court system to actually do it. And it's really interesting because this hasn't happened in hundreds of years, and there's over 100 years where there was a governor who did win, and after court cases, it was overturned because it was within those margins as well. And so if an attorney general's race in a midterm is going to come down to 200 votes in Arizona, it could be similar for the presidential race. It could be similar for the United States Senate race, because the left has poured all of their money into Arizona after 2016 when they thought that Hillary was going to be able to beat Trump in Arizona. They came for revenge in 2018. They did it effectively again in 2020. They did it effectively again in 2022. So this is really kind of the last stand in Arizona, because Abe Hamadeh's case election has really proven that.
Wow. Well, hey, Celine, welcome into the chat. So, Will, I lived in Arizona for several years. You're still currently in Arizona. So maybe just give us your initial reaction to a lot of what Austin just broke down there as someone who's currently a citizen in the swing state of Arizona.
It's profoundly upsetting. It's profoundly upsetting and disturbing. I mean,
Yeah.
not what you said, not the saying of it, but the situation that it describes. Again, for the same reason that when an election comes down to 200 votes, at a county, a city, or whatever precinct of that size, or a state, how do you even say who won that election? And when you start piecing apart where the votes came from, and you start seeing it, and then you can't even get a proper, fair hearing, trial, I feel this in my heart as an American. I feel this in my heart as a citizen, and I, along with many people, struggle against the feeling of despair when confronting the reality of that the country that I grew up in, that I still love, has a stranglehold over its electoral process, which is supposed to make us unique as a nation. That there are these external strangleholds over our ability to conduct a free and fair election, and even to audit a free and fair election. I feel this in my heart, and so I'm really grateful, Austin. I think it was that you said, we've been election interference or elections integrity is defense. We need to be playing offense. I appreciate that you framed it that way, because that fires me up. Like, okay, no more of this defense. Like, it's time to go to offense for these things. So I appreciate you. That's gonna resonate for a while.
Yeah. Well, Gavin, I want to bring you in on this because obviously you're in New York and you have a whole different beast there. And we're probably going to reference that all night, because I think you can give a unique perspective, because you are used to fighting. Because if you are going to be a conservative in New York, you're already starting 30 feet back from the starting line, compared to your competition who starts about 30 feet ahead of the starting line. So based on kind of what Austin's been spelling out for us here, what do you see as being some of the weaknesses currently that you see in Arizona, as well as maybe some opportunities that we can start to take advantage of?
Well, listen, I think Austin really went into the weeds and covered a lot of great ground. And I think what the type of seismic shifts we're seeing in Arizona, it's a playbook that's been replicated, and Austin touched on it in a state like Colorado, which, maybe a decade or two ago was a Republican bastion still, and it started at the local level. And the left, they've mastered a lot of these ideologically neutral tactics to really take advantage of these institutions, the infrastructure, and build up this very effective and weaponized network to shift states from being, red bastions to blue bastions. And the right has never been able to cope with that. And generally speaking, the right, just talking about the rhetoric alone, it's always just like, well, as soon as a place begins to turn blue, you run, you flee, you surrender. And that goes back again to what Austin was talking about and what Will highlighted in terms of the offense versus defense. And we've seen, the left has consistently tried to expand their electoral map, moving into different states. They will spend billions in unwinnable seats in Texas or in South Carolina just to begin to seed the ground, because they know that they're not playing one election cycle. They're not playing two election cycles. They're playing for the next generation. They're looking, how can we make seismic shifts that are going to, impact this state, this county, the country as a whole over the next 10, 20, 30 years. They're playing the long game. We don't play the long game on the right. And simultaneously, another thread that I noticed in what Austin was saying is that we're also fighting a two-front war. We're obviously fighting the left, and they're getting very smart with their NGO networks and all of that, but also we're fighting a simultaneous concurrent fight with our own establishment, which in many cases have the resources, have the money, have the capital, and have the technical know-how to assist. But not only do they choose, and many times not to assist, they actively subvert their fellow Republicans, because they seem far more concerned not with winning elections and winning governing majorities, but rather with controlling the caucus and with controlling their dominion within the party. They're much more concerned with this intra-party fight rather than this inter-party fight between the right and the left. And that is a massive concern, and it's a problem because the Republican Party is going through its own realignment during this entire process. The left has had a different approach. They've basically taken on their insurgent left-wing movements, and they've just moved further left as fast as possible. And that's how they've sort of maintained this unity. And it's all based on sort of like a patronage system and power sharing and all that. And, the establishment in the Democrat Party is kind of, they're not too ideological, but they just cede ground to the left whenever they can. On the other side, you have the Republican Party, and it's a constant civil war. We've seen several of these. It goes beyond just Trump. We had this with the Liberty Movement, then we had it before with the Tea Party movement. It's been a series of like intersigned fights within the Republican Party for leadership, and it's really, it inhibited us from winning in states we should be winning by the margins we should be winning in. And a lot of these grassroots candidates are sort of left by the wayside and left to fend for themselves against far more well-funded candidates with far more infrastructure. So, we're seeing, like I mentioned, the Colorado strategy, the strategy where they're infiltrating these blue states. And obviously some of this is just, demographic trends. It's people moving in. It's these cities turning into political machines. And those things happen. And a lot of times you see Republican states actively welcome it. You've seen this sort of pro-corporate approach by many Republican states, say, in Georgia with the movie credits, giving tons of tax breaks to Hollywood. I knew a lot of left-wing friends of mine from New York who moved from Brooklyn to Atlanta, and they were following the movie industry. And, it was pitched as a pro-business approach to politics, and it just ended up turning that state more competitive. You saw similar trends elsewhere, welcoming the tech companies. You're seeing it in places like Austin and Texas and all the rest. And it's constantly self-defeating. It's self-defeating policies where, Austin was talking about how the shifts in control of the legislature, the state legislature, when we have this control, when we have this power, we immediately implement policies that elevate the cohorts that oppose our views, and we don't support the cohorts that do support our views. The left is very good at rewarding loyalty. So they understand that you have people that have more college education, that are single, that don't own homes, that work in certain industries. Those people tend to vote for them. So they elevate them. Republicans, we look at the map and we say, okay, Christians vote for us, small business owners vote for us, families vote for us. But then when it comes to supporting or incentivizing those groups, then all of a sudden it's a small government. But this is we're bleeding into a broader ideological discussion there. But I also wanted to touch really quickly on a point that Will made earlier as well, that it isn't just an electoral political fight. I fully agree. It's multifaceted. We have the cultural fight. We have the spiritual fight, which I think is the most important. But at the same time, and you made this point, Will, you can't just say it's one or the other. And I think sometimes we've seen a lot of people say, I'm avoiding politics completely. I'm avoiding the culture wars, and I'm focusing on one thing. And that's where we lose. And I think that, I don't remember the exact number. I looked it up earlier. There's a massive gap. If you look at the Christians in the United States, how many are unregistered? How many are not registered to vote? How many don't vote? And if you take that, just a fraction of that gap in terms of, Christians that are voting and Christians that are not voting, we would win every election. So again, it comes down to the numbers are there. Like Austin said, structurally, a place like Arizona is a conservative state. The numbers are there in Mojave County. The numbers are there with Christians across the country as a whole, but we haven't really energized them. We haven't worked them. We haven't really brought them into a coherent system and infrastructure to turn out electoral wins and thus, bring about an American national renewal. As far as New York is concerned, I think, New York is actually, it's an interesting place. We just saw Lee Zeldin come in the mid to upper 40s in a place like New York. We're seeing a resurgence of the Republican Party in the outer boroughs of New York City. We're seeing, a tidal wave of Republicans elected on Long Island. There's certainly been pushback. I think New York, it's more of a cyclical state. It's a cyclical city. We've hit a point where it was so much one-party dominated nonsense that there was eventually going to be, a swing back on the pendulum in the other way. And I think a large part of the success and the wins that we've had in the Republican Party in New York has largely been this sort of just organic counter swing against the one-party dominance in Albany. But at the same time, I think if the Republican Party in New York, and obviously more broadly, I'm going to be biased because of my views, if they embraced a far more populist, style approach to politics, I think they would find a lot of fertile ground in a place like New York. I think in New York, we've seen the suburban, we've seen the loss of the suburbs, but that predated Trump. We were losing the suburbs in New York, on Long Island, and Westchester long before Trump. We lost the state Senate years ago. We lost, tons of assemblymen and tons of members of Congress in New York long before Trump emerged on the scene. And then when you see Trump's election and you see the numbers he's doing in certain neighborhoods and certain communities in Brooklyn and Queens and Staten Island, in these urban areas, you're seeing a shift. You're seeing a shift of a new, working class style Republican, a new, it's a Hispanic working class. It's a white working class. It's a different style Republican from the old country club. And the numbers are there. And if we were to embrace that in a place like New York, I think we would actually begin to see a reversion in trends. We'd begin to see a growth in the party. the growth in the number of elected officials, and starting to turn this one-party state back to something sort of competitive. But for the longest time, places like New York, places like California, they were the model for the left. They wanted to turn the entire country into effectively a one-party state where, the opposition, token opposition, would get 30-something% of the vote. They can't do anything legislatively. They're basically just, pawns for, some kind of bipartisan theatrics. And that was it. And then the left can run, wild with anything they wanted to do. I think in New York, it's pretty much been that way. I think there are trends that are moving in the right direction. If we're going to capitalize on them, though, it's going to take money. It's going to take resources. It's going to take energy. It's an expensive media market. And even though that there are baseline trends moving in our direction, if we don't have any sort of ideological understanding of why it's happening, if we don't actually have our pulse on the realignment, our pulse on the grassroots and the movement, the gains that, say, Lee Zeldin made are just going to evaporate in a cycle. And we're not going to be able to turn that from a one-off into a consistent, healthy progression towards a Republican renaissance in the state, which I think could happen. I think it could be in our lifetimes. It's not going to happen overnight. But beyond New York, look at the Northeast. We saw a gubernatorial election in 21 in New Jersey that was within a few points. Where was the RNC? Where were the Republican establishment? That could have been flipped. We saw a flip in Virginia. We saw a path there for a certain brand of republicanism to win a state like Virginia. So there are a lot of places that we've actually seen successes, and that the Republican Party has had very little imagination in expanding them. And in fact, the House majority ran through New York. And this, again, is a state that's largely overlooked by Republicans. So I think they need to get past sort of the old dated electoral college or the electoral view of the country that, the states that were safe in 2000 are not the same states that are safe today. And the states that were competitive in 2000, it's like we're running 20 years behind. It's like they're on Windows XP still. It's like they're just several cycles behind, and they don't get it. And then all of a sudden they're shocked. They're like, oh my God, New Jersey was close. Oh my God, New York was close. Oh my God, we won all these congressionals in New York. And it's like, yeah, because we don't even test the waters. The left will throw money in South Carolina. The left will throw money in Texas just to test the waters. They'll spend, however many millions just to see what's our max. What are we maxing this cycle with Beto? Okay, so now we have some numbers that are kind of concrete. Okay, in 10 years, maybe we can flip Texas. That's how the left thinks. And on the reverse side, we should be spending that kind of money in Michigan and Wisconsin and PA. I mean, we were talking about the map earlier. I do think, Trump is going to Erie this weekend. This is not an early primary state. This is not a state that, is going to be very influential in the primary. That's a general election move. That's a general election move. And Erie County is the purplest county.
He's starting to shift.
State. Yeah. And he sees that, and it's also close to Ohio and all the rest. It's a strategic location. But, our path to the election in 2024 really runs through the Rust Belt. And I think a lot of the stuff I just touched on with sort of the populist shift, we'll get into it later, I'm sure, but it really ties back to the Rust Belt, but also holding ground in the Sun Belt. And I think, Arizona is a huge part of that, but we talked about Nevada. I think Nevada is realigning. I think there's trends in Nevada that are fantastic, and I think they could be taken advantage of. And we need to spend money there. We need to move that needle and expand the map. So we're not looking at 3 toss-ups. We're looking at 5 toss-ups, and that's a much better path and a lot more reassurance going forward with that padding.
Right. Everything that you said is to me, if I was to sum up kind of a lot of what you were saying, especially when you brought up so many registered churchgoers that are not voting, ultimately politics is the left's religion.
Right.
Ultimately, it is a lot of what gives an atheistic worldview purpose. That's a lot of where social justice comes in. I mean, social justice, even you could argue, got its birthing from incorrect theology within the church. And, ultimately there are individuals who are focused in on this infighting. And, a lot of that's because there's a large portion of people that are more conservative leaning or apolitical that ultimately just want to be left alone. And of course, the party that wants to be left alone is always going to lose to the party that wants to control everything. We know this. We see this. A lot of people in the chat were talking about Californians coming and changing their state. They were talking about that with Colorado and so many of these other states. Arizona obviously has been affected by Californians. A lot of people that are fleeing right now are actually pretty conservative coming from California. And it is changing the demographics just all around. But either way, ultimately, us on the right who want to be left alone. We just want to start our businesses. We want to start our families. We want to go to church on Sundays. We want to just focus in on our spiritual life. This is where we do need to some degree to engage, because the reality is we're so focused on just preaching the gospel. Well, ultimately the gospel is going to have a really hard time spreading under a totalitarian regime if it gets to that point. And the reality is we are trending that way. We're not there yet. Obviously we've lost, I would say that we truly have lost some freedoms in this country. That's pretty evident by a lot of what we've seen over the past couple of years. But
well, look at
at
what
the
the
same
left
time,
does. So I was going to say, look at what the left does. I mean, they infiltrate everything. It's their Fabian long march to the institutions, and the churches are no exception. I mean, they'll take over these churches and they'll wear, this religion like a cloak, and it's totally masquerading, and they're totally twisting scripture and twisting religion to suit themselves. And then they wonder, why all these woke churches are empty. And like you walk in New York, I see all these woke churches, and you walk by and it's completely empty. I mean, it's like cobwebs. They're destroying these institutions systematically, and they're not just playing, electorally. They're playing systematically. They're taking over corporate boardrooms. They're taking over churches. They're taking over businesses. I mean, they're taking over schools. They're not just playing, a game of, electoral politics. They're playing a much more insidious, long-term game. And I do agree, it's their religion. I mean, it's not, we can't think of this in purely political terms, because like you said, they've replaced their transcendence in a higher being with this transcendence in terms of this really warped ideology, which in many ways, I mean, if you checklist of what is a religion, they check a few boxes. I mean, they have their own scripture,
original sin. They have their orthodoxy.
Yeah, their Bible is a DEI handbook. I mean, it's
COVID, climate change, like that. That's the Father and the Son right there. Like,
absolutely. Yeah, and that's a lot of what this podcast is focused on. We're called Forge and Anvil because the whole point is that we are hammering out uncomfortable conversations. The forge and the anvil are two symbols of sharpening yourself. And it's not done, when iron sharpens iron, it's not two irons kind of get up to each other, hug one another. It's, it's a violent act, and the reality is I'm hoping that these conversations that many of the apolitical churchgoers do not want to have, I hope these conversations slightly make you uncomfortable, with a desire that you would be called to action, because there's not a single realm that Christ does not call out and claim that is mine. And that includes the realm of politics. Obviously, like Will said earlier, we don't want to find our hope in politics. But of course, to not be engaged is ultimately to watch freedom of religion and the ability to even gather as believers and not have to be an underground church. We can debate theology all day long, but ultimately we're going to be debating from a jail cell if there's not some proper change, with how we're running things here. That being said, I want to dive into a more specific area here by talking about the Arizona U.S. Senate race. So this is from the Center Square. So it says the Democrat Congressman Ruben Gallego, Republican Pinal County Sheriff Mark Lamb, and Independent Senator Kirsten Sinema released their Q2 fundraising numbers in Arizona Senate this week, which paints a clearer picture of the race in its early days. Gallego raised $3.1 million in the quarter, which runs from April 1st to June 30th, whereas Lamb raised over $607,000. The Democrat entered the race in January, and he's quickly accumulated a war chest. Lamb waited till Friday to release his numbers, which also show that he has $335,000 in cash on hand and spent over $272,000. Notably, his wife Janelle Lamb was paid nearly $5,000 by the campaign for strategic consulting and mileage costs. So, actually, I do want to keep going here just a little bit more. Lamb is the only one in the race for the Republican nomination, which has arguably come to a standstill, as former gubernatorial candidate Kari Lake has continuously said she is considering a bid to replace Sinema. So there's more to that article. I'm just kind of giving you the brief breakdown. But the Senate race is another opportunity here for us to pick up some ground on the federal level, all through the same state of Arizona that we've been focused so heavily on tonight. One of the things that I found interesting specifically about the setup, first and foremost, we do see the discrepancy between the fundraising. Obviously, our opponent is much more well-funded than Lamb, but ultimately, something that I wanted to, I guess, ask both of you, Gavin and Austin, and of course, Will, you're welcome to chime in here as well. But it did talk about Carrie Lake wanting to potentially throw her hat in the ring for the Senate. Now, I love Carrie Lake, and I think that she would be a great senator, of course. I really see her more being executive, at least with the way that I've seen her campaign. But ultimately, it did make a point to say that that things kind of slowed down with her sort of tiptoeing the idea of should she or shouldn't she step into the race. So my thought is that I think Carrie just needs to either announce or choose to abstain, because it seems like this is potentially hurting Lamb's ability to fundraise right now. I mean, Austin, is that anywhere accurate, do you think?
Well, yeah, I can agree to a part of it. But Mark Lamb, great guy, good conservative. He's done really well for our state here as a sheriff. Runs his department really well. Really an upstanding guy. But that's a high burn rate. And if I was on the campaign, if I was his consultant or his campaign manager, I would say we have a problem here. Regardless if Carrie Lake is jumping into this race or not, that we don't know. We just spent a lot of money on a guy that has somewhat of a good name ID within the Republican Party already in Arizona. I don't know who his consultants are, but that's pretty high to be spending that much money after he's only been announced for a few months. So in my opinion, that's kind of unacceptable. Mm-hmm. But really in Arizona, like we're talking about, the mechanics of the state between Gallego, like Gallego's going to raise 30-40 million. Cinema's going to raise 30-40 million. She's going to have a lot of the corporate money come behind her. She's already got name ID. She's won before. Gallego is the left's darling in Arizona and within the party. He's had Pelosi come out here and raise some money for him. But at the end of the day, Ronald Reagan and Richard Nixon could be on the ballot, and we'll probably still lose Arizona regardless of who is the Senate nominee right now, because we don't have the mechanics. And so the reason I say that is because, Mitch McConnell has already signaled that he is not going to spend money on a MAGA Republican if it becomes the Republican nominee for the Senate in Arizona. That's a problem. So what that does is it signals to establishment donors in the state that I'm not going to give money to Carrie Lake if she becomes the nominee. So you could have donors that are saying, well, maybe if I don't know how many exactly, but the fact of the matter is that Carrie Lake and Katie Hobbs, two completely different candidates when they ran for governor this last time. Katie Hobbs never campaigned, extremely unpopular. She won on the margins. This is going to be a three-way race. Sinema's going to have 40 million. Gallego's going to have 30-40 million. Our Republican nominee is going to need the same amount of money, but if they have that same amount of money and there still isn't that infrastructure, that outside support, that mechanics here to chase ballots, to have our own team of Mark Elias's, we're not going to win. Mark Lamb is a good candidate. I think Mark Lamb could probably win in this three-way race. I think Carrie Lake could win in this three-way race if we have the mechanics in place and possible. Republican turnout's going to go up if and when Donald Trump becomes the Republican nominee. That's just a fact. That's what the numbers are going to point to. I can tell you from personal experience being in the legislature. So I'm in the Arizona Freedom Caucus. We're a third of the Republican members in the Arizona House and the Senate. We have been able to, we've been talking about, the election stuff that we've done, the legislation that we've done, really did well this last cycle because we put Katie Hobbs on the defensive, being, rabble-rousing freshman legislators in the Freedom Caucus, more conservative populist types compared to other times in the past, really taking back that ground. The stage that we set in 2024 to play offense regarding elections, voter registration, PAC support, C4 support, what the legislature does really is going to have to be a rising tides lift all boats. What Gavin spoke about this earlier, the left is always finding ways to test the waters, to dump $1 million into this state, to dump $1 million. They're willing to put their C4s and their PACs and their NGOs and their nonprofits off to the side with 10 or 15 million, and they say, we're going to target 3 or 4 smaller legislative districts in Arizona with $1 million in outside spending. Hopefully they're having a rising tides lift all boats. We're missing that in states like Arizona. We're missing states like that in Nevada, because if we get that kind of stuff, it's a perfect storm for our nominee, right? And so whether it's Mark Lamb or Carrie Lake, if we don't have that rising tides lift all boat mentality, we're going to have a very hard time. And so these races are still going to be one on the margin. I want to bring up something else that we were talking about that Will mentioned, that it's kind of disgusting and discouraging that we're at this point right now. But the fact of the matter is that we have other establishment Republicans and moderate Republicans and the mainstream Republicans like David Schweikert, perfect example, who for the longest time in Arizona was a more conservative member when he was first came into the Freedom Caucus in the House. He left the Arizona or the House Freedom Caucus because he blamed the local Arizona Freedom Caucus. He said that we were too populist, we were too conservative. Well, really, that's kind of like kicking the can down the road, trying to blame somebody else from your mistakes. You can't have Republicans running for office attacking the conservative base. A perfect example is this woman named Shauna Bullock, who was a state House representative, ran for Secretary of State this last time, lost the primary to Mark Fincham. She just got recently appointed back to the state Senate for resignation and attacked the Arizona Freedom Caucus. You can't have your candidates attacking the Republican base. And this is something that has happened to many, many candidates across the country that we cannot afford anymore. Because in the past, the establishment would win a Republican primary, and conservatives, we would dust ourselves off and we would get back in line to, vote for the guy with the R. The establishment doesn't do the same exact thing for the conservatives when we win the primary. And so my biggest fear is that in Arizona, Carrie Lake becomes the nominee. They're going to do that again because they did leave her out to dry. They left Blake Masters out to dry. They left Abe Hamadeh out to dry. They left Mark Fincham out to dry. And so unless the conservative base, we have to be the ones to win these elections by the margins, ballot chasing, poll watching, poll observing, volunteering, everything that we can do to win these races, because Sinema's going to have that army. Gallego's going to have that army. We're going to have to continue to build it from the grassroots up here in Arizona. And the last thing I'll mention is, Gavin talking about what they did in New York, taking back the House ran through New York 100%. The United States Senate will likely not run through Arizona. It will go through other states. It will have to go through other states because the Republican establishment has so much vitriol and hate for conservatives, and especially here in Arizona because it was controlled by John McCain, the Koch brothers, and Doug Ducey for the longest. Doug Ducey alone spent $100,000 propping up my opposition in outside spending in the Republican primary. So they're willing to take their ball and go home. And so that's, really got to think here, just because we get Carrie Lake nominated doesn't mean we're going to win, or Mark Lamb, because the Republican establishment has proven time and time again, if you nominate a MAGA or a conservative, traditional conservative, a populist, they will leave you out to dry. And so we have to mentally prepare ourselves that we're going to be spending, hopefully 12, 13 hours a day as grassroots people chasing these ballots, or we're not going to win whether we have the money or not.
Yeah, that's a great point. Will, did you want to respond? I know you were mentioned there. So
thank you guys. And earlier, I can't remember what it was in response to, but earlier I was thinking that in between the 1970s and the 1980s, there was a giant shift that happened in American culture when we went from a culture of producers to a culture of consumers. That was the big shift that happened from 1970 to 1980, especially with the arrival of Ronald Reagan and a lot of the outsourcing of manufacturing to China. And so everything that's evolved in the past, say, 40 or so years has been an emphasis on the American consumer, not the American producer. And I look at a lot of these Republicans who are attacking the conservatives as part of that, emphasizing the American consumer, not the American producer, which means that they have to be allied to international interests. And they abandon the American small business owner, they abandon the American middle-class voter in favor of these internationalist interests. And that's the biggest tragedy to see is a lot of the highest profile, quote, Republicans not actually caring about the everyday concerns of the American people. And we saw it with Mike Pence, right? Well, that's not my concern. Like, bro, what?
That was lovely.
That was wild. That was absolutely wild. And so I guess the distinction that I wanted to introduce around the word Christian, and maybe this can help introduce some subjects to how we can think about this, is I'm reading this book right now. This is just the dust jacket because the book's in the other room. The Toxic War on Masculinity by Nancy Pearcey. This is a great book, just getting into. And she has a distinction in here around the word Christian. And what she says, and this is around, it's around domestic abuse statistics. There's a narrative that runs in the public about how Christian households are the most abusive, et cetera. And what actually, when you piece that apart, what you find is that the households of Christian fathers who attend church regularly, like 3 or more times a month, actually have the lowest rates of domestic abuse in the country, the highest rates of marital satisfaction, the highest rates of sexual satisfaction in a marriage. But meanwhile, on the other side, you see the exact opposite with quote unquote nominal Christians, people who identify as Christians but don't actually put their faith into practice. The faithful Christians who attend church and are involved regularly in the church are actually the core of the American Christian faith, and those are the ones that we want to bring up and cultivate. And I think one of the things that seems so striking is that the interests of those voters are exactly 180 degrees opposite of the interests of the left. Abortion is a great example. So finding candidates that are willing to run on the issues that those Christian voters care about, the true heartbeat of America kind of people, I think that'll be key to any candidate winning. And I think that speaks to a lot of Trump's success, was that he's willing to make that, they called it a deal, but he delivered on the deal. And so maybe candidates that are willing to activate and speak to the things that I care about will be the key. And of course, that will be hated by the Republican establishment, but maybe there's a way forward with that.
It's a lot about what Austin was saying about, or actually it was Gavin that was saying this about the left. They repay their own.
Yeah.
You know, I think Trump, I mean, because if we're just being super blunt, I don't think Trump is, or at least was, super pro-life. I mean, the reality is he was a Democrat his whole life. You know, he did kind of talk. He had a bit of a conversion story when he learned a little bit more about the science behind it, as a lot of people have over the past, 15, 20 years. But still, the reality is, I think Trump was not, necessarily a staunch, abolitionist, but he was willing to put proper conservative justices on the Supreme Court. Well, he delivered to his base. That's ultimately what I'm getting at here. He delivered on multiple fronts. But please, either of you jump in.
I was talking to someone earlier today. I mean, it's just a lot of, the old institutional, even so-called conservatives, but institutional Republicans. I mean, they, George Bush would call in to the March for Life, and people would be like, "Oh my God, he called in! We can't believe
Trump actually went."
Trump went, and they held these old Republicans to such a different standard that, Bush is elected, we have the Congress, we're going to get something done, we're going to pass an amendment, we're going to repeal Roe. And it went like that, pre-Bush went like that for how many decades? 2, 3, 4 decades that they were talking about this. And it was like, oh, the Republicans are going to deliver, the Republicans are going to deliver. And, they said all the right things. And that was part of the whole bargain that they had with these neoconservatives and the evangelicals or the social cons. They said, don't worry. We're gonna take care of you. We're gonna get these things taken care of. Just keep voting for us, keep donating to us, and keep sending your sons to die overseas. But we'll certainly get to the abortion issue any minute now. And Trump comes on the scene, and I think it's fair to say what you just said, that he wasn't exactly a social conservative by any means. Coming through this, I think he was a traditionalist. I think and I think there's a distinction there. I think he has a lot of traditional values, but I don't necessarily think he was a very socially conservative guy. I think he evolved, and at the end of the day, he delivered. He got it done, and despite that, you still see people coming after him like he wasn't good enough, and they attack him from the right when he was the one that actually delivered on these things, and then they're trying to find ways to undercut it and to diminish it and all the rest. And I just think it's so disingenuous, and it just goes to show the vitriol that Austin was alluding to. There's such vitriol in the party ranks right now, from our side to theirs, their side to us, that it's more vitriol internally than it is externally towards the Dems and the left. And the Dems and the left love it, and they're certainly fueling the flames when they can. But they're certainly also trying to make examples, and that's what the establishment does. They purposely try to subvert and sabotage candidates and movements, and then say, "See, we told you guys. You should have listened to us. You lost your race, even though we spent no money. We did nothing to help you, and we actively tried to hurt you. But listen, we got you. You guys should have just been moderates, and you would have won." And that's never how it works. And then when they do win, then they still find another excuse. And it's a never-ending, narrative formation and counter-narrative formation that they try to engage in to push back. But I also love what Will said about the sort of consumerist society. I think that's absolutely true. I think this is a really macro-level topic, but it's absolutely fundamental that we have shifted from being a producing country to a consuming country. And with that, it's not just the economic implications, it is the cultural implications, the spiritual implications. We're seeing this sort of runaway capitalism, and people are just, they don't have anything but platitudes. And I'm a capitalist, I'm a free market guy, but they don't have anything but platitudes about the free market. And then we're saying, well, what we're seeing right now is this sort of cultural degeneration, and we're seeing just this hedonistic lifestyle take hold, and and you can't have a free society. You can't have this Republican form of government with these values, with these rights, with this Constitution, with this Bill of Rights, if your whole cultural and religious fabric is completely sunk and turned to mush. These things matter, and they're not easy to quantify. You can't quantify all of these types of things that make a society healthy and make a society robust and allow a society to be high trust and allow a society to be able to sustain itself and its institutions. It's hard to quantify, and it's not always going to fit into a pure, economic theorem of supply and demand. But these things matter. The founders understood that. They talked about it, and I think we've lost that in the conservative movement over the years, because we've moved from a movement that's talking about conserving things, conserving a tradition, conserving a lifestyle, conserving an American way of life, conserving all these kind of, harder to define, non-tangible things. And we've turned into exclusively a party that only talks about, GDP and the Chamber of Commerce. Yeah. It's become the Chamber of Commerce Republican Party that has been promoting things. And, I saw Twitter threads today talking about, things like the first place, the second place, and the third place. First place is your home, second place is your job, and third place is something else. And I think that's something that Americans have lost, because it's really just been kind of like this, rat race to the bottom, consuming society, all consuming, with nothing else mattering. And I think that's a kind of a big impetus for problems we're facing today.
I saw your tweets about the third place, and I really appreciated you digging into that, because we've lost a sense of community in America. Where do we as people go to gather, to be with each other and talk, rather than engaged in some other activity like watching a sports game? Like, where can we go to meet each other? And for the work that I do, where can men go to meet with other men in male-only environments? I think that's another thing we've lost.
The fraternal organizations, got killed and died, and you used to see. I mean, in New York used to be, all of these different clubs and these organizations. I mean, there was something for everybody, and it was sort of part of the fabric. And people, even in my club, because it's such an old club, 100 years ago, I look back at the old records, and it was just wild that way back then, the amount of time they dedicated and devoted to all these little things with all these different organizations, and they were part of all these boards and all these things. People don't do that anymore. You see the guys, and back then 100 years ago, it was like these New York lawyers during like the Great Depression. They were the people that ran the club, and they were doing all these sorts of things on the side, all, philanthropic, social, charitable, for political organizations, whatever. Today, you don't see that. I think those communities have sort of died, and it's really just work, home. And I think if you're just looking at it in an economic, mindset, it may make sense to you, but in other senses, it doesn't.
Yeah. Susie Q said, because they propagated the patriarchy. Yeah. I won't get Will started on that, because that could be in a whole other hour-long podcast on that alone, especially with the content Will does. But Austin, it looked like you wanted to say something, and then I wanted to move on to our next topic, but feel free to jump in if you have something.
About, the community involvement thing. We've lost that in this country, but so like I'm a member of my Elks Lodge, where I live, and because that's about community. We take care of our veterans, we take care of needy children in the community. Those are things that are like really important. My parents have been members of the Elks Lodge, the last 4 or 5 years, and it's one of the best little community gatherings that I've been around, because it's people who share your values, people who give back to their community. That they're talking about the consumer part of it and why the left has taken so much ground from the right, or people who are apolitical. You got to be like a precinct committeeman. If you're a registered Republican, you got to put some time and your own tongue in cheek into the party. You got to show up at your school board meetings. You got to be involved in your homeowners association, because everything there, unfortunately, we talk about, culture drives our politics. Well, now politics is driving our culture, unfortunately. And so you've got to be involved in your PTA. You got to be involved in HOA. Got to be involved in like your local legislative district Republican committee, your county committee. All those things matter, because it's starting to add up, and the left has figured that out, that those little institutions have a lot of sway over our everyday lives. They've already taken over the big stuff, but the bedrock, the nuts and bolts, the bread and butter stuff that makes communities strong, dads have got to be precinct committeemen. They've got to run for school board. They've got to be involved in the PTA. They've got to be involved in the church committee. They got to recruit people that are in their Bible studies with them, to go knock doors on the weekends, to find candidates that are godly men and women to run for office, because nobody's really stepped up to do that, because we've forgotten about that being a consumer society, the rat race to the bottom that Gavin was talking about. And so the community involvement is critical, to establishing that very safe community, and ultimately saving, your state and your country.
Well, for crying out loud, I mean, we have a giant movement going on right now, Moms for Liberty.
Right.
Like where's the dads, and honestly, a lot of it's because we need permission. And Will, I know you do a lot of work on this. So Renaissance of Men for you who want to know more. Will's podcast is great, dives a lot more into these topics, but men do need permission, and that's definitely something that we don't have time to go into further tonight. I love philosophy, and I want to talk about it more, but I do want to get to this as well, because this is kind of an area where philosophy and technicalities of politics intersect. So I'm going to use this tweet from Steve Deace, or if we even call it a tweet anymore, his X'd. I don't know what we're going to call it. We'll find that out. That's a whole other trail that we can go on. Yeah, next week on Forge and Anvil. Stay tuned. Next Monday, 8 p.m. Central. So from Steve Deace, these are states Republicans haven't won in a presidential election in almost 40 years, 1984, and how many votes Trump received from them in 2020. California, 6 million. New York, 3 million. I'm just rounding these numbers for you guys. Massachusetts, 1 million. Connecticut, 700,000. Minnesota, 1.5 million. Oregon, 1 million. Washington, 1.5 million. Illinois, 2.5 million. That's 17 million, again, I'm rounding for you, essentially wasted votes in a presidential election decided by less than 50,000 total votes in Arizona, Georgia, and Wisconsin, which, if swung the other way, would mean the Biden presidency would have never happened, and we'd be much better off as a country. But Steve, some of you will lecture me, one of the first people on election night who was pointing out the fraud in real time and got the entire Blaze Facebook channel demonetized for pointing out they were stealing the election. They just steal more votes, so it is pointless. And then I'm not going to read his point number one, because what they're going to do is they're going to clip me reading that point that Steve made here, and then they're going to run it as ads against Austin in his next election and say that he associates with extremists. So moving on to point two, look at how hard and obvious they had to cheat to win by less than 50,000 votes. Excuse me. If just 1% of these people would evacuate their blue state hellholes and had spread out to Arizona, Georgia, and Wisconsin, that's 170,000 more votes for Trump, or more than 4 times what they could conjure to claim they won in 2020. If just 10% or 1.7 million of our people left these places and also spread out to places like Pennsylvania and Michigan instead, Democrats would be screwed. We are a country founded by pilgrims who had to move away to find freedom. To preserve this country as patriots, we may have to become such pilgrims again. So this is something that a lot of people have talked about, the idea of moving for essentially electoral gain. And of course, there's a lot of other reasons why a person should consider moving. This is just one of the many reasons of a way that your move could be effective towards reversing some of the decline that we see in our country right now. There's actually a debate going on. Austin, Gavin, I don't know how well you guys follow this, but there's a debate among a lot of the theological minded podcasts about whether or not it's even correct to move from a blue state, or whether or not you should stay in a blue state for the sake of evangelism and so many other things. And we can get into that. I myself am not decided on this issue, because honestly, when I'm talking just political reasons, I can see pros and cons to this. Obviously what Steve laid out there is accurate. If so many conservative people from California, New York, places like this move to these swing states, we could see a big shift. But obviously we see that Congress was won through states like New York and California. So I guess first, Will, I'll turn it to you to see your initial reaction. And then Gavin, I definitely want to pick your brain on this, because I know that you living in New York, I think you can testify to the effectiveness that conservatives can have in that state. But Will, I first wanted to turn it to you to get your initial reaction to this.
Yeah, I mean, I advise all my friends to get out of blue states, to leave China. Right. And I like what Joel Webbin says about this. That's the joke that I always tell my friends.
Joel's the one that started this whole thing. Good job, Joel. You got everyone to hot water. No, go ahead.
Yeah. Well, I mean, let them. Okay. I lived in San Francisco for 15 or so years, 10, 15 years. Right. And so look at the videos coming out of San Francisco now. It's the zombie apocalypse. Look at Oakland. Look at San Francisco. Right. Let them live in the consequences of their poor decisions. And that's the only way some of these people are going to wake up, if at all. And look, I know how hardened some of the people are on the left to their own ideology. And I'll tell you guys, I was part of Occupy Wall Street for a while. It was a big part of my awakening process, right? To go into the heart of that and see how mentally ill many at the core of the left are. I was like, wow, does not seem healthy. And so that helped lead me out of that a long time ago. But the thing is, like, they're not just magically going to stop what they're doing. It is their religion, right? Now, there are plenty of good people that are caught in the middle that just can't let go of the guilt and the shame they feel at existing, right? And in order for them to wake up to the reality of how dangerous this leftist ideology is, what it's become, you have to let them see the consequences. You have to let them see the feces on the streets. You have to let them see the homeless drug addicts walking around on PCP screaming at the sky, which is a regular occurrence in San Francisco. It's so dangerous in that city in a way that most people can't comprehend. And so I don't understand why conservatives or religious conservatives would stay in these places. I literally don't understand it, especially when so much of these leftist economies are fleeing, like Oracle. I lived in San Francisco. Oracle Open World was a huge deal in San Francisco. They would take over several city blocks once a year. You could see the concerts you could hear the concerts from the whole city. Oracle Open World pulled out and left San Francisco, which is like a huge support of the economy. This is happening. And so I don't understand how conservatives or religious conservatives can remain in these environments and say, yeah, it'll be fine. It'll be fine. They don't seem to want to take that. Meanwhile, there are communities that could really use their support around the country. And so I encourage anyone to leave, who can leave, to leave, because there are people around the country who need you.
I've got some counter arguments for that, but not necessarily because I disagree with you fully, because I agree with a lot of what you're saying. It's more of devil's advocate arguments that I want to bring up. But first, I'll turn it to Gavin, because Gavin may bring up some of them. So I'll let him have first shot at it.
Yeah, I mean, look, I have some mixed views on this. I think the tweet by Steve, it's a little simplistic. I think that's happening. I mean, there is a red migration out of blue states already happening, and I think it's strengthened, say Florida, for example. I think a lot of that is just going to states that are already red, though. It's not necessarily going to purple states, which is really the basis of his electoral strategy. It really only makes sense if they're going into purple states or states that are transitioning to be purple. I don't think another 200,000 New Yorkers moving to Florida is going to change the name of the game. Right. And the other part of the problem is that those 200,000 New Yorkers, if they're going to uproot their life, are they going to move to Michigan? I mean, yeah, is Michigan a little better? But a lot of the problems Michigan faces are similar to New York. Likewise, maybe Pennsylvania or Wisconsin. I mean, these are states that are purple.
Well, the governors both killed old people, so there's that.
Exactly. So it's a tough argument to sell. It sounds better if it's simply blue to red, but blue to red doesn't do anything. And in fact, COVID saw a lot of blue to red because it concentrated our votes in areas that we didn't need it to be more concentrated in. And in fact, it made some of these purple states less competitive because they're not just moving from New York, they're moving from Michigan, they're moving from Wisconsin, they're moving from Pennsylvania, the very places that we need to keep competitive. So it's kind of the post that Steve wrote is very, very like theoretical and it's not realistic in any sense. There is already that kind of migration that's happening. And I think a lot of times in the past, people thought that migration would work against us. They assumed if you were leaving a blue state, you must have been a blue voter, when in fact, we've seen from the data that a lot of these people fleeing California and New York and elsewhere were actually Republican voters, and they actually strengthened the Republican margins in places like Texas and Florida. Yep. And, they counteracted, external migration in from outside the country. And they also counteracted a lot of what we're seeing, which really negates all of this. It's basically the indoctrination of new voters, which the left has a complete monopoly on. So it's a race against time. We could bring the last, red state blue state red refugees over. But if the schools are all pumping out, new Maoist inducted kids, and we're still importing, millions of people from abroad, it's really just a losing bargain, especially if they're just moving to red states that are solidly red. We don't need Florida to move from like a 10% red state to an 11% or 12% red state. We need to move them to the purples. So that's one issue, even though I don't necessarily disagree. I think a lot of people are naturally going to move. I would make maybe another argument, again, kind of hard to quantify, but places like New York and even San Francisco, love it or hate it, I think a lot of conservatives, they reject that there's anything of value in urban life in the cities. And I think that's also been a problem, because when you cede these grounds, you're also ceding, you're ceding parts of the culture, you're ceding control of the financial institutions, you're ceding control of the media. All these big institutions are inevitably going to be based in these concentrated areas, these concentrated urban hubs. And I'm not saying we're going to have a 50% majority anytime soon, but I'm saying there is some importance, and it's not necessarily as easy to quantify as an electoral figure, but there is importance in having a conservative presence that is somewhat lively and robust in a place like New York. And it's not going to be a majority, but it's important to have in a place like New York City, because then you'll have, a professional class that shares some of those values and can be part of institutions. And we're never going to really take those institutions or challenge them if we're simply running and hiding, and we keep moving back the trenches, we keep moving back the front line. So some of this gets a little into the weeds, but I do think that's a point that's worth mentioning on that front, and something that could be considered. And also, lastly, if we're going to go back to the electoral argument, it's not all just about the presidential elections, as I'm sure you'll bring up as the counter. These House seats, some of these other races are extremely important. They run through these blue areas. There's a lot of Republicans that are elected in California in the congressional delegation. There's a lot of Republicans that are elected in New York in the congressional delegation. So we can make it a completely blue state. And yeah, it maybe won't impact the electoral college, but then you're going to have a Republican come into office, and they're going to have a much harder time getting a governing majority in, say, the House. So it's not just such an easy one-for-one thing. There are trade-offs here. There are pros and cons. I think the bigger focus needs to be on, fighting back against the indoctrination, instilling the values and keeping those values instilled in future generations, because that's really where things are turning out the worst. Because you could have a Christian family, you could have a kid who comes from a Christian family, socially conservative household. They go 4 years in a regular, 4-year school for college. They come out as a complete lunatic. And it doesn't matter how Christian the parents were. It doesn't matter how loving and caring they are. They have built these things as indoctrination centers. I mean, look at the shooter at the Christian school with Covington in Nashville. She grew up in a Christian conservative household that went to mass and had a really good, solid upbringing. But then she went into this crazy program that we have in some of our higher education and came out a different person. And until we address that issue, the moving, 1,000 people from here to there doesn't matter. I would also say one thing about places like San Francisco, because I know Will mentioned it, I think it turns a lot of people conservatives, because I know a lot of people that lived in San Francisco went there being very politically ambivalent.
That's our indoctrination.
Neutral. Exactly. They went there, they worked in, maybe they worked at an Oracle, they worked at a tech company, and they left, and they were just like red pill, because they saw the future. They saw, the great the brave new world that the left wants to build. So, we got to use this for, those kind of purposes too. So I'm mixed on this. I see the pros, I see the cons. Maybe someone can do a period of time in a blue area, and it strengthens the results. Because I also see a lot of red states produce some of the weakest Republicans, believe it or not.
Yes.
You get a lot of these elected officials from deep red states. We talked about Asha Hutchinson before the show started. I mean, he is a product of a red state, environment. And I think there's a lot of people like him, because they've never lived on the other side of the Iron Curtain. They've never lived in New York City or San Francisco. They've just lived, the good life in Arkansas, and they've only saw, that part of America, which is largely still, thank God, been shielded from a lot of this nonsense. And they just have this very naive perspective. They're like, oh, things are fine. No, they just need, it's a healthcare surgery. Like, they don't get it. They don't get what we're up against. I think they need to go. And we need people that see what's happening on the other side. Otherwise, we're just going to continue to get these weaker and weaker Republicans, and it's all going to devolve.
Yeah. Sounds like the cops are coming for Gavin. So
can I throw something in real quick?
Yeah.
I deal with this question a lot in a different form in some of the communities that I run in. There are a lot of guys who talk about masculinity who say things like enjoy the decline, right? It's ultimately a very defeatist kind of mindset. I would suggest that you raised some really good points. I would suggest that it could be necessary for people to leave these blue states to begin moving to red states to build competing institutions, that the ability to centrally gather, say, we're going to build, because you can either infiltrate the institution, which is becoming increasingly difficult if you look anything like this, right? Your resume isn't even going to be read, right? And so what are your alternatives? Well, you can either retreat from the institutions entirely and go and flee into the wilderness. I don't recommend that. Or you can gather and begin building competing institutions. And
Yeah.
here's why that strategy wins, because the people that are taking over institutions now don't know how to build them and they don't know how to run them. They're going to drive them right into the ground. Versus the competent men that can build institutions, there is a case to be made for us to be meeting face to face and to be able to do it that way.
Yeah. That's currently what I'm working on in a red state, for that same reason. And it takes time, and there's some organizational struggles on that front right now, but it is something that I'm working on. I wanted to bring up some of those counterpoints. Shara Joel in the chat said, my husband wants us to move out of Colorado, but why should I leave? I was born here. My parents were born here. 3/4 of my grandparents were born here. The invaders should be sent packing. And Susie Q said, I am with you, Shara Joel. I'm not leaving Texas. They can come and take it. And they're trying. And anyways, I wanted to bring that up. Susie Q also said, Vody Bauckham says, if you send your kids to Caesar, don't be surprised if they come back as Romans. And that's what she's referring to about the public school when Gavin mentioned that earlier. And there's a point to be made that proper catechizing in the home could definitely prevent some of that indoctrination in the school system. But some of the people that I think are going to struggle with, those of us who say just move for electoral purposes. First of all, there are people like Shara who just have deep roots there. But beyond having deep roots there are people. I do have a friend in a blue state that he went through a bad divorce, and he has joint custody of his kids. He can't leave this blue state, or else he won't have essentially any part in his children's lives, or at least not a meaningful part. There are individuals who have their elderly parents that they have to take care of. And then there is a individual that will actually truly feel called to stay in a blue state for purpose of evangelism and political activism and things of that nature. I personally think that there are a lot of people that say that's why they are staying in California, but they're not actually doing that work. And I think that's just a poor excuse for they just don't want to change. But those are some reasons that I see as being, hard pills to swallow about moving. And of course, that is probably only, if I'm being generous, probably 10% of people that are actually in these states that have more conservative leaning values. But that being said, these are still people that can't leave. So do we just leave them to rot along with the rest of the state? That's a moral question that we have to think about. And so, Austin, maybe I'll bring you into this, because I know that you are like a third or fourth generation Arizonan, and you're currently watching your state go from red to purple to maybe blue ? So,
Yeah.
I mean, give your insight.
And that tweet brings up a really good point. Like I said, my family's been here in Arizona since before statehood, so I know the stories of what the state was like before it was an actual state, when it was just a territory. Barry Goldwater was born here before it was a state, and he was the longest serving senator that we had for Arizona. And so, like, my district in particular, I've always grown up in the West Valley in Arizona, and I always grew up in the rural part of my state in Maricopa County. The district I represent as one of the last bastions of rural Maricopa County. That's a Republican district that's just in Maricopa County, that doesn't encompass other districts. But Maricopa County has been the largest and fastest growing county in the country for like the last decade. Building houses, bringing in these corporations, bringing in these new businesses, which has been ultimately good for the state economically wise. But politically, we've become more of a swing state. We've lost a lot of ground in cultural institutions here. We've lost a lot of political, ground here. And so to say that, if we just had 10,000 more people from California come to Arizona, that are Republican voters, we're going to flip the state back. It's not the case. It's all a ground up. It's a building block thing, a foundational thing. And most people from California, they don't just end up in Arizona. They do go to Texas. They do go to Colorado. They go to Nevada. My fiance, she's from Illinois. She lived right on the border of Illinois and Wisconsin. We do get a lot of Midwest transplants, and they're like, wow, this weather is beautiful year round. I don't have to deal with snow and ice, 8 months out of the year. I think I'm just going to stay here and drink a margarita on my porch year round, swim in my pool, And so people enjoy that stuff. And part of it is that, maybe they've had that Midwest Democrat culture where they lived, and so now they have brought it to Arizona. And so there's a lot of things that have really pulled into play here with Arizona, on top of the demographic change that we've had here of Hispanic population increase. But that's another point I'll bring up before I go to this, is that in 2016 in South Phoenix, if you guys don't know, that's a much more Hispanic area in Arizona. Southern Phoenix is. In 2020, Trump did better than he did in 2016 there. And we've made a lot of inroads in Hispanic communities in Arizona because of conservative leaders. when Barack Obama was running for president for re-election in 2012, he didn't pivot to be moderate, coming through these elections. He stayed in his ground and even got further left. And so that you can make a case that, just because you have these transplants coming in from these other states doesn't necessarily mean that they're moderate voters or that they're Republican voters. You have to stick true to your values, your morals, and your convictions, what brings people here. But, states like southern states where they have a culture, places like New York where they have a culture, places in the Midwest where they have a culture. Arizona's in this unique spot because it's a melting pot of different cultures between Hispanic communities, Midwest communities, rural communities, families like mine who have been here for several generations, people who just showed up 40 days ago. And so, New York, they have, hundreds of years of families that have come to New York from other countries. The Midwest, the same exact thing. California, same exact way. So Arizona is like, it was the last state in the union that was of the territorial 48 that was admitted to the union. And so, a lot of people don't understand that. It's like, well, if Arizona just had more Republican voters, it would be different. Not necessarily. It's always going to be a cultural thing here. So I don't know if you guys know this or not, but like Arizona now has like the largest semiconductor plant that has just been built here. Yeah. And so there's going to be a lot of people from Taiwan that move to Arizona. I'm hoping that this is kind of a turning point because we've had a lot of California companies come to Arizona and they have brought a lot of Democrat voters with them. Taiwanese people, they are on the much more cultural conservative side. I'm hoping those folks coming to Arizona, bringing not just those who work for the Taiwan Semiconductor, but the other parts of their culture that are coming to Arizona, because Taiwan is a conservative country, a more free-loving country. So I'm hoping that coming to Arizona will change the dynamic shift. But and I'll end it with, you got to stay here. My cousin is a perfect example. Not a political guy. He's Christian conservative in our family. And, he's ready to leave Arizona because he knows the story of like where our family came from and has seen the degradation of Arizona politically and a little bit of culture here because a lot of people, really didn't have a stake in their community. That's why it's so important when Gavin talks about New York, that those people that are there, they love their community. They're staying there to fight for it. The same exact thing applies to Arizona for these families that have been here for so long. But everybody's just kind of inundated of all these new people that are coming here, all these cultures that are coming here. It's this new battleground swing state. We don't have to worry about it anymore. That's what the old GOP thought, but that's changed now. And so it's going to be, a decade and a half, almost 2 decades before Arizona is really on a path for maybe like Florida and Ohio are. And so that's why I'm staying in the fight. That's why I ran for the legislature, because it's the bottom up. It's the ground up. Everybody will talk. If you're watching the show and you're not really political, obviously the presidential election cycle is a big thing. Electing a president is. It's like, but there's more people who affect your life that are on your city and town council and your board of supervisors, your count, and your state representative and your state senator than your United States senator and congressman do. And so that local impact really changes the politics of your state.
Yeah, I completely agree. Austin did mention that Taiwan is a country, so I will have to censor him for the rest of this stream. But no, of course,
drone strike inbound.
Yeah, but ultimately, I think there's just no clear-cut answer, and it's really easy to say that there is, because a lot of the arguments that like Joel Webbin has made, for example, is just the idea that your taxes are going to be funding a lot of these things that are adamantly opposed to your values in some of these states, especially as they raise, the percentage that you are taxed. But again, I think the greater solution just ultimately boils down to, if you are someone that wants to skirt by without being involved, well, the reality is like you can do that, of course. And I don't think that you are necessarily. Not everyone is called to be involved in politics on the same level. Not everyone's called to run for office like Austin has done. And not everyone is called to be a grassroots activist like Gavin. And, but, ultimately, I think to some degree, everyone should have some form of civic duty because the reality, to whom much has been given, much will be required. That is a principle that we live by. And the reality is we have been given, we won the lottery by just being born in America. As believers and just citizens in general. And the reality is, if we watch this country just fall apart because of inaction, I mean, we're going to be held accountable to that to some degree. I'm not saying that there's people that are going to be, losing their eternal salvation because they weren't, a precinct committeeman or something like that. Of course, I'm not going to ever pretend that is something that is salvific in nature. But I do think that in general, all of our actions are going to be weighed accordingly on Judgment Day. And, there's arguments to be made that we should be doing our very best each day to claim the civic sphere for the glory of Christ. So ultimately, that's up to you to decide. I mean, any final thoughts on this from any of you?
No, beautifully stated.
All right. Awesome. Well, thank you guys. We went a little bit over in our time. I know we had some other topics that I had ready to go in case we had time to do it, but we won't drag this out much longer because we definitely thoroughly beat those other topics, and it was a great conversation. I really appreciated having both of you on. That being said, Austin, where can people go to find you and keep up with everything that you are a part of?
Yeah, Connor, Will, Gavin, great being with you guys. Thanks for having me on. Great conversation with good conservative, Christian, patriotic men. You can find me on Twitter at AZAustinSmith. Same thing on Instagram at AZAustinSmith. Or you can go to my campaign website, austinforarizona.com.
Awesome. And Gavin, where can people go to find you?
It was great being on. I really enjoyed the discussion. We have to do this again. You can follow me at Gavin Wax on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, all the rest, gavinwax.com. My articles are available on Town Hall, Daily Caller, Newsmax, and you can follow the club, nyyrc.com. If you're in the New York metropolitan area, we'd love to have you join and get involved. And again, this was a great discussion. Hope to do it again.
Awesome. Will, where can people find you?
Thanks, guys. This was awesome. Austin, you're out there in the wilderness, out there in the far West Valley, in the rugged frontier. You can find me on Twitter, Instagram, basically everywhere at Ren of Men, and you can go to renofmen.com/links, and you can find links to my podcast and everything else.
Awesome. Well, thank you everyone for listening. We have been Forge and Anvil, and we will see you next time.